Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Schriever Spacepower series. I'm Jennifer Reeves, Senior Resident Fellow for Space Studies at the Mitchell Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence. Almost 5 years after being founded, the U.S. Space Force continues to evolve. As space becomes an increasingly contested and strategically vital domain, the Space Force's mission has never been more important. Rising to this challenge will, of course, largely come down to having not just the right capabilities, but also to recruiting, training, and retaining the right people. A significant milestone in addressing these challenges came with the passage of the Space Force Personnel Management Act as part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. This groundbreaking legislation marks a paradigm shift in how the Space Force manages its workforce. It introduces unprecedented flexibility in personnel management, allowing the service to better retain highly skilled members and offering new pathways for private sector talent to serve part-time. To talk us through these complex and exciting developments, we are honored to have with us Ms. Katharine Kelley, the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Human Capital. Ms. Kelley, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you.
Thank you very much for the invite. I'm delighted to be here and talk about this pretty important, and I appreciate your opening comments, groundbreaking legislation. This is really exciting for the Space Force.
Yes, ma'am. And so I'd like to kick things off by just giving you the opportunity to chat about, set it all up for us. Tell us what's going on in your words. Thanks.
I will start with there's a lot going on. There is a lot going on. You know, at the 5-year mark of the Space Force, there is simultaneously the natural evolution of what a new service needs to do to stand up, coupled with some unbelievably groundbreaking new flexibilities and abilities that are afforded to the Space Force, which are just an unbelievable opportunity and also a lot for the service to tackle. So it's quite a busy time. It's a busy time for all the right reasons. And it's also, I would say, in the context of what we're seeing in our national security these days, it's an imperative for the Space Force to get this right. And so we are focused on a number of issues that have to do with talent management, talent development, making sure that we have access to the right talent, and quite frankly, aligning things that make sense for what the Space Force mission actually is. So lots going on. Things that are, quite frankly, not only setting a foundation for the service, but also, I would argue, in large extent, we are also experimenting on behalf of the Department of Defense. This new model that we're talking about here, and I think we'll have some conversations today about, is really something that the Department of Defense has been wrestling with for years. And we are very fortunate in the Space Force to have the support of not only Congress, but the Department of Defense in order to really try to move some things forward. So lots to talk about, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Well, we are thrilled. So we're going to dive into some of these topics, as you mentioned, before we move on to audience Q&A. But what I do want to say to the audience is that today, due to some interesting circumstances, we're going to ask anyone who has questions to actually type them into the Q&A function on your Zoom, okay? And that's how we'll be taking questions towards the end of today's show. So here we go. The Space Force Personnel Management Act, again, as part of the 2024 NDAA, of course, it's a significant shift. And yes, everyone wants to know how this is going to go, not just for the Space Force, but maybe for application further. So walk us through the key elements, if you would, and how it's reshaping the concept of service for Guardians in the Space Force.
I'd love to talk about that. It's something that I think we really need to think about in a completely new paradigm shift. And that's not just to say that because it's new legislation. It's really fundamentally a different way that we're going to manage talent in this particular service. And there's a couple of interesting points about why. The Space Force is, in my opinion, and I think shared by many, a really different model of military service to the nation, irrespective of the legislation, because we don't have as much of the traditional pickup and go physical deployment mobility requirements that many of the other services do. There's a large percentage of the Space Force that is doing its mission 24/7 today, much of it CONUS based. And that is all going to continue to be in place, whether or not we're in conflict or in a peacetime environment. Sure. The work continues. That's an important point and distinction, because many of the other services have a different type of paradigm where they're in an organized, train, and equip model, but when they're in a deployed status, it's a physical pick up and go, right?
Sure.
I think for the Space Force, it's important to leverage the fact that we have a different type of employed in place model. And that becomes an interesting distinction, because you are trying to build a talent base and build a structure of talent management that is to support an ecosystem in that type of environment. Now, we of course do have missions that do deploy, but by and large, our SPA4 Gen rotations that I'm sure I'll get into as we talk today, those force generation models are happening 24/7 today. And so we're building some talent models to support that. And the reason I start there is because the full and part-time aspects of the new legislation allow us to, what I call, bespoke manage where and how that part-time work role will be defined. And so the legislation essentially does this. Today, in other services, there are what I call firewalls, if you will. Read that to be legislative barriers, if you will, between a reserve component, an active component, or a guard component. And other services have a mix of what those are. The new legislation for the Space Force has just the Space Force with no components, but inside that Title X authority, you can have a mix of full or part-time. So the paradigm shift is essentially you don't have to physically change your status and move into a different legal framework. It can all be done inside the Space Force as a guardian. And that fundamentally is the underpinning of what's so new about this. Now, the legislation is over 225-ish pages, so there's a whole lot more to it. But really what it does is it allows the Space Force, without any components, to manage a talent base in a full or a part-time work role collectively together.
Yeah, that's really spectacular. And I know everyone is waiting to see how this turns out. So, right, because traditional military career paths have been pretty rigid. You're either in one component or you're in another, right? And those lines generally don't cross. So now we've only had the first several folks come, I think, from the reserve into the Space Force. I believe they were full-timers at this point, but how do you see this happening? I know and remind me, there's some time we have to implement this, right? So how do you actually see this sort of playing out for Guardians being able to move between those full-time and those part-time positions?
I think, first of all, you're exactly right. So far, we've had just a handful come in directly from the reserves to the Space Force. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the amount of inter-service transfers that the Space Force already has, right? So it's a really powerful mix of talent that's already in the service, because clearly we brought over a lot of former airmen with all of their background in space, cyber, intel, acquisition. But we've also gone out and opened these windows of opportunity over the last 5 years to bring in other service members, Army, Navy, right? So, so we have like truly a population with a varying degree of experience and background already, which is kind of cool.
Yes.
And so I like to make sure I acknowledge that, because the power of that background of experience is really one of the strengths, I think, of the Space Force going forward. We've also recently, just this summer, opened up our first opportunity for space professionals in the reserves to join the Space Force. Now, they're joining as a today guardian. I refer to it as a today guardian for a couple of reasons, because we haven't yet taken the entire service and moved it legally into this new legislative authority yet. So they're basically joining the Space Force as a full-time guardian today. And that's really exciting for us because we only had about 300 positions to bring in this year, and we had over 450 applicants, and it's still growing.
Oh, that's awesome.
So the demand signal is there, the interest is there. The space professionals that are in the reserves today are interested in joining the Space Force, and we're really thrilled to be able to bring them on board in this next iteration of our inter-service transfers.
I love that.
Yeah.
So do we see, do you have a vision for how it might work between, say, for an individual guardian who may have something going on in their life that they would like to go, I mean, part-time for an amount of time and then maybe back full-time? What do you envision that as looking like?
Yeah,
the
so
flipping back and forth.
That's the piece that I think the teams are still fleshing out in
Mhm.
great detail, but conceptually, we know where we're going with
Okay.
this. The idea, it centers on a couple of hypotheses that we
Mhm.
think are going to bear out. One is there's a lot of data out there that talks about when you force somebody to make a binary choice between staying in the service in an active status versus I want or need to go do something in my personal life that is important. So the things that come to mind for most people when we talk about these scenarios are starting a family, caring for a loved one, maybe a commitment to an education program that's a full-time commitment. I think there's a lot of scenarios that happen in normal life today where the structures that are in place in other components really make it a tough choice for that service member to say, okay, for me to continue in this career path, I've got to continue to hit all these wickets and all these gates, but I've got this other thing in my personal life that I really need or want to do. And so what we're trying to do is not make that have to be a one or nothing decision.
Right.
We're trying to figure out a way to make those things marry together. And so what the legislation allows us to do is create some part-time work roles in the service that you can basically volunteer to do. And if you're selected by the service and you meet the qualifications of the work, you can transition into that part-time work role, but you didn't lose your status as a guardian. You
Right.
didn't transfer out of the Space Force or out of a component or become a part-timer per se. You're just still within the service ecosystem. So the case in point is, if anybody who's been in the reserves has ever tried to transition between statuses, there's this administrative black chasm between that, where people have delayed pay, they have delayed administrative support, you're not quite sure what the status is of your benefits. All of that becomes not an issue because they are still a guardian, whether they're coming to work in a full-time capacity or they're delivering content for us in a part-time work role. And so that's the game changer. And the idea would be that people can balance those other things that are happening in their life, like any of us have happen, and not have to do it at the expense of maintaining their connection with the service and their commitment to serve, which quite frankly are two of our core values.
I think that's great. As a former commander, the number of highly capable, excuse me, young women that we lost when it was just the time in life when they were ready to have families and they had to make that binary choice.
Very true.
So really excited to hear about this because I think it will be a true benefit to keeping just to retaining quality members, right?
Absolutely.
I love it. I love
Absolutely.
it. So
Jen, one other point.
oh, please.
If I could make another point on that. There's another scenario that is very often talked about, and it has to do with what we're all dealing with at the beginning of our lives and towards the end of our lives. And statistically speaking, there's a lot of people who have to care for aging parents, care for them in their later years. So there's this paradigm of what's happening in your life, but there's also a paradigm of where you might want to grow and develop in other ecosystems. And that was my earlier comment about education opportunities or working in the private sector. And so make no mistake, the Space Force knows quite well the dynamic environment that we're operating in right now. If you turn on any news outlet or any kind of social media, we all recognize what's happening in the space community writ large. And so it's a fast moving, high tech environment that relevancy, agility, and speed really matter. And so part of this model is designed to allow us to keep a closer relationship with what's happening in the private sector.
Great.
And with what some of those thought processes and technology developments look like, because let's face it, we all know how difficult it can be to keep those relationships tight. And so the idea being somebody could still be in the Space Force as a part-time guardian. Maybe they're working, 20 hours a week or even 10 hours a week per se. And they're doing something else in that other space in their life that is still complementary to the Space Force.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's just a lot of potential here for this new model, especially for what the Space Force is trying to do, to really force multiply. And I'll just make this point as well. The size of our service today, but that coupled with what's at stake for national security, we need to take advantage of every force multiplication option we have. And this is one of them.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And what a great way to think about it. And I'm personally pleased that is in the forefront of this construct. That's
Sure.
Great. So the Space Force currently relies on some Air Force units for some of its operations. And as the Space Force implements the PMA, how do you think it will continue to integrate with or potentially replace some of the existing structures that we're relying on?
This is one of the great partnerships that we have in place right now. And it's generally the relationship between the space community and the Air Force community, which is still an unbelievably strong and powerful relationship. Many people don't know that the Space Force itself is really focused on space, cyber, intel, and acquisitions. Everything else is essentially provided through some mechanism from the Air Force. We are very much dependent and in a good way partnered with the Air Force for many support mechanisms. And that's an important point because absent that support, the Space Force doesn't have the inherent structure or manpower inside the service to support itself independently at today's juncture. So that relationship has got to sustain and got to remain important and powerful for our relationships.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So let's dive into the whole SPA4Gen issue, right? So space operations is highly technical. And as you've mentioned, when talking about what part-timers can do, it can become quickly outdated, given how quickly the environment is changing. So how do you ensure, the Space Force, ensure that all Guardians, officer and enlisted, receive the necessary ongoing training to maintain those technical and leadership skills?
Great question. Let me make a couple of points on SPA4Gen that I think are really important, and then we'll talk about some kind of exciting training opportunities that we've got going on. So there's been a real focus inside the service to acknowledge a couple of things that have foundationally shifted in the space ecosystem. And General Saltzman is the one that really put the finest point on this particular narrative. And it's really about understanding and communicating that the space domain today is a much different domain than that of 10, 15, 20 years ago. We are now in a highly contested environment that really needs a whole different level of skill set and a whole different level of awareness, not to mention the agility and the technical savvy that I talked about earlier. So this is no longer a benign space domain where we're focused on awareness and tracking and sight picture. We're talking about being able to make very quick decisions, move data, produce decision quality things for commanders on the ground, and be an enabler to the joint fight. And that, quite frankly, is a significant shift forward for what the Space Force has been asked to do in many, many years prior.
Right.
So it's important that we recognize that foundational change, because that needs to drive fundamental training and organizing change inside of our service. So OT&E, organize, train, and equip. That is what a Title X service is asked to do, right? So organize is really what SPA4Gen is all about. How do I create the teaming structure that is resilient and able to cover the globe and the clock all day, every day, with respect to what Space Force brings to the Department of Defense, and most notably to combatant commanders when they need assets. So SPA4Gen really is about making sure we've got enough crew with the right skill set and the right ability to be in rotation and off rotation, right? You have got to create mental space for people to actually take a moment, upskill, reskill, refresh, take care of personal life, and then get back in the rotation. And so that's what SPA4Gen is really about. It's about creating the ecosystem where people can be focused on console and then focused off console on the supporting structures that are necessary to keep them relevant and resilient to come back into that rotation.
Do it all again.
You got it. You
Yes.
got it. And that's why I mentioned earlier when we were discussing in the beginning, why understanding how Space Force delivers its capabilities is a little bit different than other services.
Sure.
This is a 24/7 gig that we're doing all the time. You know, when you go to bed as an American on any given day, this is still happening. You know, this is not seen and not known until you pick your phone up and you type in something that you want to go to, and you have just leveraged Space Force assets.
Exactly.
It takes a lot to do that 24/7 across this nation.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's exciting.
It is.
Um,
Can I touch on training for just a
I
moment?
would love it if you did.
Yeah, so the idea behind the model is as we just discussed, create the ecosystem where people have the ability to deliver the skill set necessary, and then have a moment to come off of that rotation and take care of everything that needs to be taken care of. That's not a new concept per se. You know, military services know how to put people in and pull people out and give that dwell time that is necessary to bring people back up to ready to fight. What is different for the Space Force, though, is the paradigm that we want all of our space professionals on the officer side at the moment to have an exposure to all the disciplines of the service. And this is a very, very fundamental shift for us.
Yeah.
You know, typically you're trained, you're anointed something earlier in your career, and then you're trained in that skill, and then you move through that linear path
Right.
throughout your career. This is a different paradigm. This is hypothesis number one, is that we need to expose our officers at this point in the game to all disciplines so that they are best prepared to lead these core teams with multiple disciplines on them. So a basic exposure to intelligence, a basic exposure to cybersecurity and cyber protection, and then an understanding of what it takes to actually operate in the space disciplines.
Mhm.
The idea is that all officers coming into the service will have exposure to all of those, and then they will go on to a first assignment after that program. That first assignment will allow them more insight into what each of these disciplines actually feels like from a day-to-day basis, which, by the way, is kind of a paradigm shift for the military, to allow somebody to understand the work they might be getting into before they get assigned to be that type of person.
In the work.
Right? So this is a big shift in that sense. But the idea is that we're creating an ecosystem that actually understands the various skill sets necessary to bring together all of those space power disciplines that are necessary to be effective for the joint fight. So that's a fundamental shift.
Love it.
And it's really, really a game changer. On the enlisted side, I will mention that we have a expectation for our enlisted force to be highly technical and with depth and experience in very specific disciplines. And so for our enlisted force, what we're doing is creating a much more robust training pipeline for each of our disciplines, so that that technical expertise and that technical depth that we are going to be expecting from our enlisted force is what they are not only prepared and trained to deliver, but a real part of our talent ecosystem as we go forward.
I love it. So that officer course, are we off and running with that already?
We are, absolutely. We had our first kickoff in September. Starcom did a fantastic job of getting that course off the ground, and it was a big, big lift across the entire, I'll say, personnel ecosystem inside of the service. But we've got hundreds of officers in the course right now today starting.
What are you hearing? Anything?
I'm hearing that so far it's going well. They are only in their first phase, if you will, because we've broken it up into 3 main phases. So we'll get some real meaningful feedback as soon as they transition to that next phase as well.
I mean, it's another thing that everyone is waiting to hear how it goes, right? Oh, it's really exciting. So many exciting things going on. So, so that was officer and enlisted. Well, what about our civilian guardians? Can you talk to me about what opportunities exist to enhance their skills, both technical, specialized, leadership, all of it? What are we doing for them?
I love the question. So one of the foundational documents that we published in this past year is a work roles paper for officer, enlisted, and civilian. And the paper really describes a lot of what I just talked about. It also describes the expectation for our civilians. And this is my personal view on where we go as a service. The civilian ecosystem for the Space Force is unbelievably powerful. Generally speaking, we're still about 50-50 officer and civilian, military and civilian. And we have civilians doing a whole host of functions. They are doing functions that are actually directly supporting our space disciplines, as well as the more traditional support functions that you might expect for any service. So think finance, budget, acquisition, HR, security, you name it. There's all sorts of functions that our civilians do. So one of the things that we're working on is tailoring training for them that allows them to continue that technical expertise that they bring based on the job series and the experience base that they have, but also create a better exposure and awareness to how the Space Force is actually going to support the joint fight. What we found is that there's a lot of people, both nationally in our country and even in our own service, who are still trying to figure out exactly what the Space Force is bringing to the fight. And I think we found that is not just external awareness challenges. We've got to actually educate our own force. So we've also got opportunities that really show our civilians how they fit into this ecosystem that is the Space Force and how their direct contribution contributes to this overall mission. So we're very excited about where that goes. And we just kicked off what we're right now calling sort of an exposure to the Space Force mission for our civilians, because many of them have been doing their function and doing a great job for years. But remember my earlier comments about how this domain has changed? We need to give everybody an awareness of what is at stake and what the real space environment looks like today. And we're intentionally focusing that on the civilian side as well.
I love it. Well, and that could continue to evolve.
Absolutely.
Right?
And no doubt will.
Yeah. So having those processes in place to keep everybody in the loop. I mean, people want to be part of something. They want to be part of something big and exciting and important.
And they're in the right place for that.
Absolutely. So, so let's talk about hanging on to people, right? The private sector in space, as you yourself already mentioned, is an alternative for military and government space professionals. And we've got options now, right, with the PMA on how you can maybe do a little of both. So how are you adapting? Again, I say you, the Space Force, adapting recruitment strategies to attract and retain top talent, right? It's, as you already said, it's very alluring what's happening outside of the Space Force as well. So how do we go after it? I know we're being successful. You've already mentioned that, but how are we doing it?
Well, what we're first and foremost doing is not presuming that our current success will always be the case. I think we have an advantage right now with the size that we are, that our demand to join is still exceeding our ability to actually take people. But
Everybody wants that problem.
Everybody,
wants
every service wants that
problem.
problem, and that's a good problem to have right
Yeah.
now. But what it really, really says to us is that we cannot rest on our laurels, and we cannot presume that that will always be the case.
Sure.
There's no greater risk, I think, if we don't continue to consider how the service, and if the service does grow, how would we continue to build our pipelines for talent? So we have a laser focus on this. So just this year, a couple of things that are really, really interesting that I think are going to have great value, especially in the long term. One is that we have partnered with the Air Force on a more distinct recruiting squadron focused on space and soliciting those potential guardians through our enlisted pipelines. A very important point for us. And while the Air Force has done a tremendous job of making the recruiting pipeline happen for the guardians that we have today, and they will continue to do so. We also know that when people make choices to join organizations, they really want to feel like they're joining a certain organization. And so we're looking to make sure that we're exposing them to a guardian much earlier in the recruitment process than we were previously, because Air Force was really helping us and doing the recruiting for us. That's a big shift for us, because we had to really make some tough choices about how much resource could we push into that? Because in the Space Force, every guardian who's not on a console or not in space, cyber, intel, or force modernization is not directly contributing to that operational mission. And so we have to make very, very intentional choices about when we have people doing other functions. The beauty of what we're doing in this model is we're starting small, and we're making kind of a bespoke kind of concept of how we want to go find that talent and bring it in, and make sure that the vetting process is going to solicit not only the right technical experience, but that future guardian who has the ability to deliver in those domains that we need it to deliver in. On the civilian side, there's some really interesting things happening. We are partnered with OSD for a pilot program that is basically creating something similar to ROTC, but for civilian employment.
Wow, interesting.
It's really, really cool.
And in college.
Absolutely.
Oh, how interesting.
So we're partnered with several universities, and DoD has a pilot program. And basically, if the college student is interested in the Space Force, or quite frankly, many opportunities in the DoD, we're not the only participants, but we've had great success so far. They can volunteer to come and work with the Space Force on projects during their summer break. When they do that, they get an exposure to what's a civilian job in the Space Force, and what does it mean to be a civilian employee or a federal employee in the Space Force. There's still a lot of data out there that shows that a lot of the United States doesn't understand that you can be in the military, but be a civilian and be supported and be supporting, right? So this exposes that talent population in some of these schools to those opportunities. And then they go back, they do their normal school year. When they graduate, we guarantee them a job.
Wow.
They join the Space Force as a guardian, as a civilian when they graduate college. So conceptually, it has a lot of parallels to what an ROTC program does, right? You're in college, you're getting exposure to the military, and then you have a job when you graduate, right?
Wow.
We're experimenting with how that model and the goodness of that model could work on the civilian side as well.
That sounds amazing. Do we have a time horizon that we're allowed to talk about when this might be implemented?
Well, we've already done a year and, well, 2 years. We're into the second year.
How cool.
Yes, we're into the second year. And the permissions, if you will, that Congress gave DoD to experiment in this space, I think give it at least 3 to 5 years of runway. So we'll be able to see how this works out and how many people actually take the job offer and then how it goes.
Oh, that's really exciting. And I know I may be off script a little bit, but do we have a place where people who might be interested and who see this, where they could get some more information about
Yes,
something like that?
definitely.
Okay, so
On our
I'll have to make
website,
sure.
we have all sorts of information, and the Defense Civilian Training Corps is really the acronym that manages the program at the DoD level, and there's all sorts of information there.
That's amazing. How exciting for young people
It is.
that there aren't just exciting challenges and interesting career paths for them, but kind of different flavors inside the same, it's like sort of the same mission set. I think that's really wonderful. It's lovely to have options.
It is. And I think what we're doing a much better job of as a Department of Defense in many of the recent years is talking openly about the breadth and the breadth of opportunity and the depth of experience that we can offer people, right? You can serve in the traditional military capacity, but you can also serve as a civilian, and both of those ecosystems not only must be in place, but they must be connected to each other, and you can be part of that team. And there's a lot of data out there that shows that America's youth is really interested in being part of something bigger than just themselves.
Yeah.
And if we can offer them a varying degree of options on how to do that, there's a great set of opportunities that the Space Force can present.
And I think that's great. So, okay, so let's keep talking about these new and interesting things. So maybe some of the implementation challenges that we might be looking at, because all of this sounds really wonderful. The options sound great. I'm sure young people out there are excited for all of it, right? But from an organizational perspective, I can imagine just the hurdles that have to be overcome to actually put in place some of the many, all of the things that the Space Force has been charged with in legislation, but then the added on sort of bespokeness, if you will, of how to deal with individual situations, all of that. So what do you see as the major organizational challenges in rolling out any of it, the part-time model, the new programs, sort of across the board with training, any of it? What are you seeing as challenges that have to be overcome?
There's no shortage of challenges, like any new organization.
Sure.
There is always exponentially more things to do than resources available to do them. So that's kind of an obvious comment, but I think it's worth starting there for the Space Force, because so much of what the Space Force is being asked to do is also additive to these new and groundbreaking things. So it's not just standing up the service, it's standing up the service, figuring itself out, acknowledging that the space domain is fundamentally different, now trying to define how the service injects into the joint ecosystem and into the Department of Defense. And then, oh, by the way, let's completely reshape and experiment on behalf of the department for new talent management. Right. And then let's try to do that with a huge dependency on existing current systems.
Yeah.
And a huge continued lash up to how we manage talent from an actual technical standpoint. The point I'm making is that the Space Force has to leverage the HR ecosystem that the Air Force has in place, by and large. And that ecosystem is pretty antiquated, and the Air Force is doing unbelievable things right now to break free of some of the legacy models and really modernize the architectures. But all of those endeavors were preceding the Space Force Personnel Management Act. So a lot of what our limiting factors are to the execution side of our new legislation have to do with how we can manage and influence the system architectures to support these new talent models. So it's a significant challenge that I was very pleased that was recognized when Congress provided this authority for us, because they gave us 5 years to try to implement, with a recognition that A, you need to do this smartly, and you need to do this deliberately, and B, you wanted to do it with minimum negative impact on anybody as an individual. And so we're fortunate that we had that runway space in the legislation. So this first year of execution that we're in was focused on that first offering that we made for those space reservists to join the Space Force. And we're excited on how that's gone. Again, we've got huge amount of interest and maybe more interest than we have space at the moment, but we will get there. And I think these next 4 years of execution window are going to be focused on how do we create the ecosystem in the IT world to support the HR that is now fundamentally different than what the Air Force has in place today.
Right. What I keep thinking about is that the Space Force is not just a mini-me of any service, particularly the Air Force. It's not. It's been charged with a completely different mission set. and to do it in a different way. And so the challenge of setting up new HR sort of management systems, if you will, right? I mean, to deal with the, how do you get a performance report? I mean, how do you get it to a person? How do you make sure it's in a record? Where do the records live? That kind of thing. I imagine that's got to be big hurdles to overcome.
Roughly speaking, and this question is one of those that you'll get a slightly different answer no matter who you ask, but we think there's easily over 300 systems in play today that somehow touch on the ecosystem of managing talent in the DoD.
Sure.
Right. And I'm emphasizing DoD here too, right? And that's not even discussing really where we go with external touch points that really matter for military, right? How your data flows to the VA matters. How you're right. I mean, so think about all the external touch points as well as we go through this. And this challenge is not unique to the Personnel Management Act. It's not unique to the Space Force. This is one of the biggest strategic challenges that the Department of Defense in the HR portfolio have writ large today. And every service is working furiously to try to modernize these systems.
Yeah, I truly believe that everyone's out there doing their best. It's just conditions change very quickly. And it's hard to move an organization with 3 million people in it. And so it's exciting stuff though, right?
It is. I mean, the thing that I think we're very fortunate to have to our advantage is a great partnership with the Air Force, great support from the Department of Defense and OSD. And we've got to just continue to leverage those to the greatest extent possible and make smart decisions on what we really need to change and what we can live with for a while. Because it's too big a leap to try to just go to something entirely different at the moment. Although we've got to, in parallel, think about if that's the long game. But we've really got to continue to leverage the existing systems and make them work for us so we can work through this execution and implementation period.
Well, we're certainly excited to hear about how it goes for the full-time versus part-time hurdle, because it's such a groundbreaking concept, but the actual management of, going from mandates and points and other constructs that may or may not exist in the new structure going forward, I think is going to be very interesting. And people and organizations are going to want to hear about that for a variety of reasons. I mean, everyone's waiting.
And rightly so. And rightly so. And there will always be a demand signal for, well, how and when, right?
Yes.
How and when. And I get asked that all the time. And basically, the idea is it's a construct that has to be fully fleshed out before we can actually say this date and this is how.
Okay.
Because it is that complicated. It really is. And you just articulated a lot of what makes it complex.
Right.
And if you imagine that the systems that underpin some of the challenges you just mentioned are really what we have to work with at the moment.
Sure.
So this is a weaving game as much as it is
Yeah.
defining what those new policies and procedures should look like.
And again, like you've said, I want to go back and say it again. I feel like everyone is doing the best they can with what they have.
Oh, yeah.
So no one's doing anything untoward here. Everyone's trying to move the ball forward. It's just a big, wicked problem.
It's a wicked problem. It's a wicked problem strategically for the entire department. And the Space Force is trying to do this and make sure that it redefines its own ecosystem anyway. Right. So both of those conditions are at play on any given day for us. What's the policy today look like? And what's the policy in the future look like? And we try our best to marry those two together as much as we can.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about sort of taking care of guardians, right? We've talked about sort of systems and whatnot up to this point and processes and big ideas, but what does the Space Force do differently perhaps than other services in taking care of its guardians and their families? And we've talked a little bit about the split between Space Force and Air Force, but as a space person for 29 years in the Air Force, I'm very interested in what the initiatives are and thoughts are about taking care of guardians specifically and their families, and what may be different.
Well, there's a couple of things that we're doing that I think are really interesting, and it sort of amplifies this theme we've been talking about today about experimentation on behalf of a larger ecosystem like the DoD. So probably one of the biggest differences right now today is that we have got probably 80-something%. I think the latest number I saw was around 82% of our guardians who have volunteered to be part of our wearables program, which is a really exciting research study to see what type of behaviors and health behaviors specifically we can understand in order to determine whether wearable technology like a watch or a ring that many of us have in our personal lives, we're looking to see how can that be part of the military ecosystem going forward, especially for the Space Force. And there's a couple reasons for this. We are told by the Department of Defense to tailor a physical fitness program to the unique needs of your service. And so we actually are mandated to define what that should be for Space Force. And so we've really put a lot of intentional thought into getting more fidelity from our guardians on what does it really mean to be ready to come to work and fit and mentally prepared for the job we're asking you to do. And so there's a really interesting experiment that's ongoing right now that uses wearable technology and allows a guardian to give us a level of specified data to make sure that they're meeting their minimum physical fitness standards, but they have access to a whole host of additional data that the device presents only to them. And they can get an unbelievable amount of self-awareness about how their lifestyle and their lifestyle choices are impacting their ability to be fit on duty. And that's a really important point for the military, right?
That is great.
It is great. That study, I think, will illuminate what can other services and what should the Space Force do with wearable technology in the future.
Very cool.
It is cool.
All right.
The other piece that I would offer is that we've coupled with that tech a human dimension, and that is our Guardian Resilience teams. The Guardian Resilience teams are out among our Space Force bases. We also have virtual teams, by the way, access to them, especially for our guardians who are not, co-located on a typical Space Force base. But the GRIT teams, as we call them, Guardian Resilience Team, it has a host of functions that span both physical fitness as well as mental fitness, as well as spiritual fitness, and collectively together are a resource for our guardians to tap into. And that really speaks to the general discussions and implementation that the Department of Defense and the Space Force is working on with respect to true resiliency and physical fitness for the force. So the idea is these resources are available for the guardians to understand more of what the data is telling them from their device, but also get advice and professional options on how they can better leverage their own health and wellness. And so that health and wellness piece is a deliberate focus for the Space Force writ large right now. And these GRIT teams are really where our guardians are able to intersect and get that kind of content.
Yeah, I think that's really important. With the amount of shift work that goes on with all of that, I think it's really important.
It is.
That's lovely.
It is.
Okay, so let's, we're about to go to questions, but I do have one more that I'm really interested in, and that is how we think the Space Force will and perhaps needs to grow from like an end strength perspective. Do you have any thoughts about what it should look like? Just balancing everything. We've got a force that we have now, we've got a threat environment, we have training that has to happen, we've the new constructs under the PMA. How do you see this affecting where we need to go from an end strength perspective?
I really appreciate the question. The thinking that we're doing right now in the Space Force is the demand signal for guardians in the Department of Defense ecosystem far outweighs the number of guardians that we not only have from an end strength perspective, but also you have to grow and develop talent, right? Even if somebody said your end strength is now very much increased, you still have to create that talent.
You can't flip a switch.
Exactly. So we're mindful of what it takes to grow smartly. But what I think is really the salient point here is really focusing on how the Space Force as a service organizes, trains, and equips guardians to then be force presented in a joint fight. That's really fundamentally where our focus is. And those analyses and those plans that we are working on right now are likely going to drive an increased demand signal.
Okay.
It is inevitable that if you're a new service, you have got to be plugged into the joint fight. Right now, we're starting to get there in some areas. We're not where we need to be writ large. So we know putting presence into COCOMs is a critical growth path for us. And we've got to continue to outline what that should look like, both in the near term and also outline what that should look like in the future. The other piece is really about the current force and the true future force. And that's what our Futures Command concept is really designed to help us illuminate. We're pulling together both concepts and doctrine and technology together with wargaming and our space warfighting analyses functions, and creating a futures construct that is going to help us see what that future force design really needs to look like, which undoubtedly will change some of our methodology and our thinking on end strength and force structure. But that's what you have to do as a new service. You have got to figure out how to inject yourself into the existing ecosystem, and to do it smartly, and to do it in a way that has measured growth that you can obtain. And so we're really trying to be thoughtful about how we define those requirements.
Super. And it's going to be exciting.
It is.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. Maybe a little growth.
Maybe. We'll take it. We'll take it.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been absolutely spectacular. And I think we're definitely opening the session to questions from the audience. So remember, everyone, that we'll be taking Q&A through the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your affiliation. And with that, Aiden, who do we have first?
First, we have Robert Chabron. He asks, how do you anticipate the shift from full-time to part-time and back affecting a Guardian's development and promotion opportunities? Will the traditional gates for promotion and advancement, both for officer and enlisted, need to become more fluid to support this?
It's a great question, Robert. Thank you for it. Right now, what we're conceptualizing is that we envision one promotion ecosystem, whether you have served in a full or a part-time capacity. The idea is that we're going to highly value credentialing, certifications, qualifications, and training. And those can be garnered whether you're in full or part-time work roles. And so the idea that the team is fleshing out for us right now is, how do we build a promotion ecosystem that values both types of work roles simultaneously? And there's an important point that I should mention here, and your question tees it up perfectly. You know, everyone in the Space Force, both today and in the future, is a guardian, whether you're an officer, an enlisted member, or a civilian. None of that changes with the Personnel Management Act. And the difference with the Personnel Management Act is really about the type of work role you're performing. It's not about you being a part-timer or you being a full-timer. Everybody is just a guardian. And the decision is really, how are you delivering work for the service? Is it in a full-time capacity or a part-time capacity? So part of the promotion ecosystem and the talent and development ecosystem is going to be designed to make sure that people have opportunities. And we're going to be very intentional about talking to the entire ecosystem about what those work roles will look like and what it will take as you go forward to continue to progress in your career.
Awesome.
Great
Thanks.
question.
Okay, Aiden, what's next?
Next, we have a question from Kathleen Markey of Campfire Capital. She asks, how do you address the potentials for conflict of interest for those civilian part-time guardians who are also working for private companies in the defense industry or space sector?
Yeah, great question. In fact, we had a lengthy conversation, especially with members on the Hill as we were talking through the potential for this legislation. You know, we know today that, especially in the reserve side, there are great ways to create those ethics firewalls that are necessary to make sure that you don't have those conflict of interest concerns. And so we anticipate we'll adopt a lot of those same methodologies. I do also think that we're going to have to be a little more mindful of what that person is doing in the personal capacity and what the work role is that they may be performing in the Space Force. So we've got more work to do to really define what that looks like. But it's a great point. It was one that we had to address head on in the legislative cycle as we were talking through this. And where we've landed is to adopt some of those existing legal frameworks that are already in place today to preclude this from happening in the other services that are already managing in this type of environment. And we'll make any adjustments that may be necessary for the Space Force.
Super.
Great question.
Awesome. Let's move on to the next one. Aiden?
Greg Hadley of Air and Space Forces magazine asks, are there any short-term impacts from the officer training course that you are tracking? Maybe lengthening service commitments or adjusting the process for feeding Guardians into operational units?
You know, we really thought at first that the officer training course might impact things like service commitments. We did a lot of analysis on that, and we don't think so at this time. Where I think there is going to be some more explaining that we need to do as a service is making sure that that officers who are coming through ROTC or the Academy or OCS really understand what this first year to 2 years of their career is going to look like. And I think that's incumbent upon us in the service to make sure that we explain that, because we have gotten a little bit of feedback that says, hey, if you don't tell them what they're going to definitively be doing before they join, they won't join. Well, first, not true. Data does not bear that out. But I do think there is something to the strategic point there, which is to be very upfront with people about what this really is going to feel like. The power of this model goes beyond creating the officer corps with the exposure to the different disciplines that I already talked about. It's also a paradigm shift of giving a potential officer in this service a little bit of say in what they're going to do and how they're going to participate. And that's very different. You know, most services just pick you and tell you what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And this model allows them to come in and a little bit of, you know, try before you buy concept, expose them to these disciplines, give them a first operational tour so they really understand how these disciplines interact with each other, and then take some of their preference into account before we make a final decision on what type of guardian this person really should be. And that to me is really powerful additional aspect of what we think this officer training course is going to do.
Because fingers crossed, then they stick around for however long we want them to stick around for, right? And maybe they will, and maybe they won't.
Absolutely. I mean, do what you love, right? And so giving people a little more feeling of what their day-to-day work life will feel like in that discipline, we believe over time is going to completely make a retention thing
Right.
a less of any kind of challenge. Now we're very fortunate right now that we don't have any retention issues either. But again, you can't rest on your laurels. You have to know that over time that could happen. So
Sure.
what are the things we can be doing on the front end of somebody's career today to improve our chances of not having a retention problem? Put people into jobs that they like and are good at. And part of that is let them get a taste of it.
Perfect.
Right?
Perfect. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, Nate.
Two that are closely related. An anonymous attendee asks, what type of jobs is the civilian ROTC program that you mentioned starting to place people into? Will they be crew or ops potentially? And then a final closing question. Why should young people consider joining the Space Force, and how can we better highlight some of the opportunities like the ROTC program that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think we've got for this coming cycle an ops position for a brand new civilian, but it's certainly something that we will consider. We have civilians today that are directly on our ops floors functioning, but because we're trying to make sure that the training and development is there before that happens, we would likely put a civilian into some sort of a support function before they get to that level of complex conditions. All that to say, some of the ideas that we've had a lot of students that are interested in our R&D work. We've had a lot of students interested in what the problem-solving technologies need to be for space. We've had programs out in Colorado Springs where we've had multiple students interested in trying to figure out how weather conditions impact on satellite architectures. So there's a whole host of scientific and problem-solving related questions that our initial students who are civilians in this program have both participated in on a summer rotation, and we anticipate we'll be able to bring students in those types of work roles.
Awesome. I mean, it's such exciting happenings all around the Space Force. Very, very cool.
It is cool. To the tail end of that prior question, just understanding what's happening in the space world writ large, understanding how important space technology is to our way of life, and understanding a little bit of the international landscape with respect to national defense are probably the three things I would offer anybody who's counseling or talking or mentoring our younger talent to consider when they consider a Space Force career, whether it's military or civilian. The ecosystem that the Space Force is responsible for and will continue to develop allows you to participate in any number of ways, and in, quite frankly, pretty flexible ways, and allows you to not only have a direct contact with national security, but also just the way we live our life. So those are my plugs for people who might be interested in convincing people to be interested in the Space Force as a potential career.
A perfect way to end. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this episode of the Schriever Spacepower series. Thank you again, Ms. Kelley, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been spectacular. And from all of us here at MI Space, have a great Spacepower kind of day.